Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to see that the students have survived. You have to know that they've been walking down the city for 2 hours in the sun. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here for this public lecture in the context of this summer school on European humanism in the making. And this year we are dealing with populism. And we have the pleasure to welcome two excellent, brilliant teachers of the house. This one is trying to disappear. Here's the camera. Okay, you have to come here, okay? And I know that something special has been prepared to present your curricula, so I'm not going to say anything else, but maybe as a vice rector in charge of international relations, you have a word to say to the audience.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to all, and I'm very happy to see you back for some of you and to see you all students here. So I'm Ioannis Panoussis. I'm the Vice President, Vice Rector of our university in charge of international development, and I'm very happy and honored to host the 6th edition of our summer school on European humanism. Naturally, I'm the authority that invites, but today I don't feel really confident with that because I have two president rectors with us. So I think that they will also say a word concerning the welcome of our students. 2 words on the spirit of this European humanism summer school. We believe a lot in this university in European values. We believe a lot in our European Federation of Catholic Universities in European values, and European humanism is one of the core elements on which we constructed European Union and the rest of the European adventure, I would say. And this week, as the 5 other weeks that we had last year and the years before, are moments within which we share what we believe that Europe should be and what Europe is. A Europe of peace, a Europe of friendship, a Europe where human is in the center of our beliefs and of everything that we are doing every day. I hope that this week will be a wonderful week for you and that you will leave this Lille summer school having a lot of interesting experiences with us, but also especially with your friends coming from all around Europe and Lebanon. If I understood well, there are some Lebanese students here. So thank you very much for being here with us. And I will leave the floor to Thérèse and Thierry to say a word for the rest. Once again, thank you a lot to our friends coming from all around Europe every year for this summer school, and naturally to Barbara for being also one of the persons without whom we wouldn't have this success, and Sarah for hosting everything at the Faculty of Law at the Université Catholique de Lille. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Ioannis and Andrew. We are very pleased, Father Thierry Magnin and myself, to be here. Personally, I am quitting this university this day after you and after 49 years of work in my university. But very happy to finish with you because Thierry Magnin and myself were very much involved in the European Federation of Catholic University of Europe and Lebanon. And Father Thierry Magnin proposed, when he was the president of this federation, to build the project and to build this European summer program with the help of Barbara and many of the professors that we are very happy to see here. Dear Peter, dear Michael, dear Fernando from Spain, and perhaps I forget somebody. Yes, Paolo Monti from Sacré-Cœur, Italy. And after that, I do my best in order that this summer school came in Lille for some years. So very happy to see you tonight and to have the pleasure to present our two lecturers of this day. I have to present Andrew Glencross, and Thierry will present Ioannis Panoussis. Andrew Glencross has been the director of ESPOL since June 2023. ESPOL is our European School of Political and Social Sciences, and he's a professor of political science. Originally from the north of England, he graduated from the University of Cambridge with a degree in social and political studies and a Master of Philosophy in historical studies. A former Joseph Hodges Coate Fellow at Harvard University, 2002-01, he completed his doctoral thesis at the European University Institute in Florence under the supervision of Friedrich Kratochvil. From 2008 to 2010, he was a lecturer in international relations at the University of Pennsylvania. Upon returning to Europe in 2010, he taught at several institutions, including the universities of Aberdeen, Stirling, and Aston, before joining ESPOL in September 2021. He has also been a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and an associate editor for the European Consortium for Political Research Press. His research focuses on European integration, EU-UK relations, and the geopolitics of EU foreign policy. Andrew Glencross is bilingual in English and French. Welcome to Andrew.
Thank you, Therese. I think it's a quite good opportunity for Therese and myself just to introduce you, because it is also my last day as co-responsible of Catholic University. So you see, after 42 years in university, in public university and in Catholic university as a physicist and theologian. A very good connection between the two, a little bit strong. And I was in fact rector at the Catholic University in Lyon, in France. You see, in the center of France, when we built with many professors here this summer program about European humanisms in the making. So very happy to manage with Teresa this last session for us, your first one. Welcome here and welcome in France. I just want to introduce Ioannis, Professor Ioannis Panoussis. Ioannis Panoussis coming from Greece. So a very important place for humanism, as you know quite well, in Athens. And so it's really a pleasure to introduce this session for Ioannis. Professor Ioannis Panoussis, Vice Rector, as we said previously, in charge of international development of the Catholic University in Lille. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Law, and now Sarah is the new Dean. And from 2014 to 2025. So it's very recent. He is also the academic co-director of a Master of International and European Law, specializing in human rights, security, and development. He holds a PhD in Public International Law, Human Rights. His research and teaching activity primarily focus on international human rights laws. So very important for European humanisms in the making. Yeah? Public international law, also European law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. He was an expert for the United Nations HCR, judge at the French National Court for Asylum, representing the United Nations HCR, and for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He held a mission in Afghanistan aiming to promote human rights and to educate Afghan nationals working for the government, NGOs, and international organizations. He is frequently invited as visiting lecturer and expert in many prestigious institutions, particularly in France, in the École Nationale d'Administration, which is the little bit the top for French policy. L'Institut National des Droits de l'Homme, little bit in French, is very good for everybody, I think. The business school, EDEC Business School, ISEG Business School, and also some schools in Brazil. He was also part of the selection committee for the Belgium National Funds for Research. So the two are very well involved in many, many very different fields. So I think we are very lucky to hear the two and then to give some good questions and to know better about populism and how to work in these fields. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Thierry, Thérèse. So just to explain that we are going to take each one of us about 20 minutes to present the legal perspective and the political perspective of populism. For my side, populism and human rights. But I know that you already had a super presentation from our co-director of the Master in Human Rights, Security and Development, Valentina Volpe today. I would like also to say to Thérèse and Thierry that it is not yet over, and that's why I didn't present you, because I wanted to give it to keep that moment for the end. So there will be also 5 minutes at the end for our colleagues. They will always be colleagues here, and it is very important for us to celebrate them one more time. They do extra hours today in order to stay with us. Normally, they had to be at home after work, and they accepted to be here with us because they are very important for this summer school, once again. So I will talk about populism and human rights, and I will give you a legal perspective, and I hope that there won't be a lot of repetitions with Valentina this morning. So we're going to begin by defining populism and human rights. And as you saw, I didn't say populism versus human rights, but populism and human rights. And we're going to see if there is an opposition or not. So defining populism, I searched in specific dictionaries, a law dictionary and Britannica from Cambridge, the law dictionary. Populism is defined as a movement, usually in politics, in which a politician claims to represent the sentiments of the people. Usually, a populist will try to represent the claims of the oppressed population. This, for the moment, could be pretty compatible with human rights. That's why you didn't see a versus in the title. If we take the common wording, populism is a political program or movement that champions or claims to champion the common person, usually by favorable contrast with a real or perceived elite or establishment. Once again, when you see these two definitions, the first thing that we could say is that this discourse, the populist discourse, populism, is not per se incompatible with human rights. Why? Because we could read, for example, that there is here a need to protect the most vulnerable. Why not? This could be a good beginning. If we define human rights now, is there an opposition? Not really. What are human rights? If you read the definition given by the UN, by the United Nations, human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, etc., etc. If you read the definition given by the Council of Europe, protecting human rights in Europe, human rights are about respecting the human being, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, and ensuring the dignity of the human being. Once again, considering that the populist is interested in order to protect the most vulnerable, I cannot read here a sort of opposition, at least not immediate opposition. If I try to now give a legal definition, that especially from an international human rights law point of view, of what human rights are. If you are searching for elements in order to do like Thierry would do, like a scientist, I find 3 elements that give us the capacity to define human rights from, once again, an international perspective. What are these three elements? First of all, we are dealing with rights that we find in international instruments, and these rights could be, for example, political or civil rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. There is not a limitation of what we call human rights. So we have to search in the different legal instruments to see what we are dealing with. And we are dealing with a lot of things, protecting the human as a being, in order to begin, life, against torture. We can find also his judicial guarantees, liberty of expression, of association, etc., etc. There are a lot of elements. You also find these economic or social elements, the right to work, for example, the right to health, access to culture. You can see once again that this could be concerns of a populist or of a populist government. I would like that the people I represent have access to all those elements. To whom, who is the beneficiary of these rights? From human rights perspective and international human rights law perspective, the beneficiary of human rights are individuals, either human beings, either, it depends on the system, private persons such as corporations. For example, I as an individual would have human rights, but also if we consider that in Europe, a political party have human rights, the right of association and liberty of expression, for example. So a populist political party would have human rights, such as the liberty to express a different opinion. Who is responsible to promote and to protect these rights? From an international perspective, and this is very important if we do the distinction with national law, the one that has the responsibility to protect is the state authorities. So let's come back to the populist discourse. I'm trying to protect the vulnerable against whom? Against elites and the establishment, so against the state. If there is an excessive approach of something, arbitrary measures, for example, taken by the state, then I give the capacity to an individual to act against the state. So populists are playing on that ground, saying, I'm trying to give full equality, for example, to people that don't have access equally to all services given by the state. This is the main elements of political discourse they are using in order to arrive to the power. So they are saying, sometimes we promote human rights of the nationals from those that are our electors living in our country. Do we need international mechanism of safeguard? Do we need a judge in order to consider that human rights exist? The answer is no. We don't need the existence of a judge in order to say that human rights exist, but we need the existence of a judge in order to make these rights effective. Effectiveness is something extremely important. Is that clear until now? So there is not immediately, first remark, we don't see immediately a clash between populism and human rights. I would say even further that populists, in order to exist, need human rights. They need human rights. They are not just considering that they promote human rights. This is false, naturally. We're going to see it in a few minutes. But they also need human rights in order to exist. 3 examples. This is not an exhaustive list. First of all, they need freedom of association and freedom of expression. Why? I need an association, a political party is an association, in order to promote a different opinion, a different way of thinking in my state. And I need the state and human rights to protect this capacity to create a new political party and to participate, why not, to free elections. We're going to see that in 1 minute. What's the purpose of this association, this party? To express itself, its point of views. Can they express any point of view? This is the magic of what we call liberty of expression through human rights perspective. Why? Because liberty of expression doesn't apply only to easy and wonderful ideas. As the European Court of Human Rights said, for example, here is the Association Ekin case that we are using. It is not only applicable to information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb. So I need an association to exist, and I need to have the capacity to shock, to disturb, to offend, because this is the way I exist, against the establishment, against the elites. One more time. Second human rights that they need, if they are a political party, naturally, free elections. I need free elections. Why? Because my purpose as a political party is to win and one day to be the establishment. In order to do that, I need democratic values. Sometimes populists say, we are here fighting for democracy, real democracy. Vote for me and you're going to see what real democracy is. And they need, naturally, for liberal states to promote and to protect the capacity, even of these parties, extreme wing, right or left, to exist in order to promote these ideas that can shock, offend, or disturb. Third, and this is very important concerning the content of the discourse, they claim, as we already said, to protect the vulnerable against the elite, mostly against the state authorities in place. What are they considering that they are promoting? They promote economic redistribution, equality, non-discrimination. For whom? For the nationals, against the foreigners sometimes. The protection of the national, the protection of the family, conservative values, the social services, etc., etc. So we see that there is a link, a connection between populism and human rights. And finally, human rights could be also a tool for them to exist. But this is theory. And as a professor, I do a lot of theory, isn't it? But as you heard, I was also a practitioner. So as a practitioner, but we are going to also use theory, let's see if what we just said is true. The reality behind populist ideas. Jan Werner Müller wrote a book in University of Pennsylvania Press, What is Populism? And he begins by saying that one of the fundamental elements that defines populism is the fact that they consider that they are anti-pluralists. From the moment we are taking the power, then we don't accept different opinions. They consider that only they are and represent the real people. Only they represent the real people. They represent the people. The Colombian leader, José Gaitán, that was assassinated in 1948, was saying, I'm not a man, but a people. We are the people. The problem is that the real people is extracted from the totality of the rest of the people. The real people that voted for me are those that need of protection. The others, what are they? The enemies of the real people. And that's how we consider that the opposition becomes dangerous. And that is why the main element of their discourse is that finally, pluralism and freedom becomes what? A menace for our democracies or their democracies. Finally, we are against the others. And that's how we begin to breach human rights of the others. The populist rhetoric. The populist rhetoric, I liked a lot what the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe said about that. He said, like I began, there is not an immediate opposition between populism and human rights. However, in practice, whenever a populist party won elections, what happened? It happened that they targeted all occasionally liberal parties, European human rights elites, and the systems that they represent. They became the fighters against what we believe in, against what offered them the capacity to arrive to the power. They often defend a crude majoritarianism, as you can see here, that denies the legitimacy of any form of minority of opposition or opposition. And finally, they become the fighters of minorities and oppositions, the enemies of that. So some examples here given by the High Commissioner. They, when populists turn against constitutional courts or watchdog NGOs promoting human rights, the alarm concerning human rights rings bells. When the people defended by populists are an imagined homogeneous community, migrants and minorities become a threat. This is what is happening in populist governments. In addition, this homogeneous community is portrayed as one appropriately dominated by traditional patriarchal families. Then LGBTI, women's rights, feminism are concepts that we have to fight against. So populism is a threat to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law. These three concepts are pretty linked. There is not a democracy without human rights, without rule of law. Democracy guarantees pluralism, pluralism and the rights of all. This is the opposite of the ground, of the political ground of populism. They defend a form of pureness of the people. They are against foreigners, against LGBTI, against liberal parties. The rule of law. The rule of law is the guarantee of the existence of a legal background that is effective. It also refers to the existence of effective mechanisms and judges. But the judge is considered as the elite himself. The judge is the enemy defending the establishment because generally they put limits to the populist ideas. The existence of a judge, so the judge, rule of law, laws, the judge, this corresponds to the rule of law, is a guarantee of our democracies. Why? Because democracies need checks and balances. There is no democracy if you go through autocracy. You need always a power in order to control another power. But if you take the populist ideas, we consider normally that we need a charismatic leader having all the powers in their hands. So there is not an executive, there is not a legislative, and even less, we don't need the judiciary. The judiciary, we have to combat against it. So you can see that finally populism becomes a threat to the main values of our democratic societies and human rights. There is a doctrinal classification of the populist rhetoric. Alison Brisk is at the origin and gives the floor to four different elements on which we find basis of the breaches in human rights. The people versus the state is at the origin of some breaches of human rights. The people versus the other, the people's patriarch versus feminism and gender rights, the people in power versus civil society. These are all grounds of violations of human rights. Let's take some examples. This will be the second part of my presentation that will be done in 5 minutes. So, first of all, the people against the state. Their main objective is dismantling the judiciary and political opposition. Here we will take examples. In Europe, one of the last examples I take, there is not yet a case law on it because it is too early. The 22nd of May, 2025, Giorgia Meloni convinced 8 other leaders, political leaders in Europe, in order to adopt an open letter against the European Court of Human Rights. Why? Because they consider that the power of interpretation of judges, and especially the fact that they interpret the European Convention at the life of nowadays conditions of life, evolutive interpretation of human rights, what is happening today. I'm trying to adapt the human rights adopted in the 50s to the reality of 2025. This is a great menace to their existence and to their states and to their sovereignty. Why? Because the judges introduce new restrictive interpretations of the powers of the state. They disapprove any form of control, especially if it comes from elsewhere. And what is elsewhere? Elsewhere is Europe and European values. They oppose national sovereignty to the existence of European institutions, and they consider that these institutions are not legitimate in order to take any form of decision that restricts their powers, because their power comes from the people, not the power of this enemy of the people. Other examples, Hungary. I'm sorry if there are any Hungarian students here, but I will take Hungary as an example 2 or 3 times today. Hungary, and especially Orbán's government, took a lot of decisions that were contrary to human rights. One of the elements I wanted to discuss with you concerning this conflict of the judiciary is a very famous case, the Baka versus Hungary case in 2016. In 2016, there was the European Court of Human Rights considered that Hungary violated the European Convention on Human Rights. Why? Because the Orbán government decided to dismiss the president of the Hungarian Supreme Court. Why? Because he criticized the government. You imagine what we are talking and what we are dealing with? We are saying that the separation of powers is necessary in a democratic society. Okay, but if this judiciary has an opinion which is contrary to my government, then I dismiss the president. We don't need him anymore. Naturally, the European Court considered that this was a breach to Article 10, freedom of expression, but also to Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, right to a fair trial, and the European Court condemned politically motivated interferences with the judiciary independence. Another example that we can take in order to see how they handle political opposition is what happened in Turkey. Again, there is not yet a decision on that, as it is an example of April 2025, but you saw that Erdogan, we can consider that Erdogan is a populist. Erdogan took the decision to arrest the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Why? Because he was the main opposition leader against the government at stake. So after that, what did they do? They also arrested more than 2,000 people in the street in Istanbul in order to explain that all these people were the enemies of the democratic values that are naturally promoted and protected by Erdogan. I come back to Hungary because there was also a very interesting approach of the European Parliament. In 2022, the European Parliament considered that Hungary is not anymore a democracy, but became a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy. Even though we are using democratic means in order to arrive to the power, we became an authoritarian regime. Second example I wanted to take, the fear of the foreigner. This is something that we find in populist regimes. Just in order to say that we are also looking to what is happening the other side of the Atlantic, you saw what is happening actually in the United States of America. Trump's actual policy against migrants is absolutely awful. Arbitrary arrestings, exceptional measures of refoulement, even for people that are in the US for more than 20 or 30 years. This is absolutely criminal, I would say. In Europe, we have the same situation in some states. In Hungary again, Hungary was convicted at least 3 times from the EU Court of Justice, considering the way they were treating asylum seekers. This was one of my specialties, as you understood. I was working also for the UNHCR for some years. What happened? They considered, the European Court of Justice considered that the Roske transit zone, where we were putting thousands of migrants that were seeking for asylum, was not a transit zone, but a detention zone. And they were doing whatever they could in order to avoid that these people ask for asylum. Why? Because from the moment you ask for asylum, the state has to protect you until there is a final decision. So they didn't want them to enter in the state on the territory of Hungary. So there are a lot of decisions, especially in 2000, 3 important decisions. And the European Commission tried to make these decisions effective. And hopefully Hungary didn't execute the judgments of the European Court of Justice. And that's why Hungary was convicted again in 2024 for not respecting any rule concerning asylum in Europe. And the European Court of Justice considered that this was unprecedented and exceptionally serious infringement of the EU law. How can we act against this kind of infringement? Finally, we took also financial measures against Hungary. You are not respecting your obligations. You are not taking the necessary legal measures I'm asking for. Okay, the Commission stops to offer different funds to Hungary for a specific period of time and pronounces a fine of 200 million of euros and 2 million per day of non-execution. And that's how Hungary decided to change a little bit its position, not too much. Attempts to LGBTI rights, just in order to have some examples, populist governments often limit legal recognitions of same-sex relationships, restrict freedom of expression and assembly for LGBTI, promote anti-LGBTI laws under the guise of protecting families or traditional values, undermine protection against discrimination. Once again, in Hungary, you can see that we have some examples, important examples of that. In 2021, for example, Hungary adopted an anti-LGBTI propaganda law that bans any form of portrayal of LGBTI content to minors. The European Court of Justice, once again, has now to offer a judgment on that. And it was very interesting to see that the General Advocate of the European Court of Justice consider, and is asking to the European Court of Justice to consider that there is a breach of Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, which refers to the European values and especially, en clin d'œil, to European humanism and what are the values of Europe are. We don't know yet if the court will do so. We have other examples in Poland or in Russia, just to cite Russia. Why? Because we also have some European Court of Justice decisions here, especially Bayev and others versus Russia, where there was a criminalization of homosexual propaganda. This is what Russia was saying. Naturally, the European Court of Human Rights considered that there was a huge discrimination here on the basis of liberty of expression. And Fedotova and others versus Russia, this is the Grand Chamber that delivered the judgment concerning same-sex relationships. The court considers that Russia failed to provide any legal recognition of same-sex couples. Finally, what we see, there is a huge breach of the liberty of expression, denial of any form of pluralism. They try to control the media and any form of information. In Hungary, once again, we can see that the KESMA media conglomerate is controlling more than 500 different medias. In Poland, under the PiS, which was the former party, we see that the public Polska press took the lead over the private media. For example, the Orlens Group, which was representing the opposition. Legal restriction on speech in Russia. This is extremely important. Probably you heard about it. But in Russia, they adopted a law which is called Foreign Agent Law. And they consider that any NGO that receives funds from a foreign country is considered as a spy. And this is a criminal offense. In Turkey, they adopted broad anti-terrorism laws used to silence journalists or academics. And in other countries like Slovenia or Poland, there was targeting of journalists and opponents every time they had positions against the government, the populist government. So, is populism a human rights? Are they compatible? The answer is naturally not. What can we do and how human rights could serve? Human rights are the cornerstone to protect democracies and the rule of law. It is not just theory. We need human rights in order to control any arbitrary positions of any state in any European or other country concerned by the international instruments of protection of human rights. I won't do all the slide, but I want you to have in mind that generally on the basis of human rights, we offer the capacity to states to take any necessary measure in order to act, even in specific circumstances, like COVID, for example, but states have to use specific legal regimes, such as restrictions or derogations. They have to respect some specific conditions. If they don't respect the specific conditions, then the European Court of Human Rights and any other judge, international or national, has the capacity to control excessive approaches of states through 3 or 4 important principles. I will just deliver some of them. Necessity in a democratic society. When you take a restrictive measure, this restrictive measure must be absolutely necessary in our democratic society. If not, it is contrary to human rights. It is a limit to your powers. Any measure has to be proportionate to the situation you are trying to handle. Proportionality is an element of appreciation for judges. Non-discrimination. Every person living in this territory has the same rights. It is not because I'm Greek that I have less rights than French people in France. So we have to protect everybody the same way. And we offer the capacity to international judges also to fight against, to struggle against any form of abuse of rights. Why? Because there is a main principle in human rights in general that says that the liberty of one person stops when the liberty of another person begins. You cannot use your rights in order to breach the rights of others. This is a limit that judges have to protect, to promote. That's why I consider that judges are the watchdogs of our democratic societies and offer guarantees against the national authorities. This is the only way, I believe, to protect and promote our European values and especially European humanism, which is at the heart of our discussions today. Thank you very much for your attention. So let me now welcome once again Andrew Glencross, professor in political science and director of ESPOL. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the very humbling introduction by Thérèse and Thierry that I really appreciate on their last day of work. Yeah. And I think what's really nice there is the idea that we're also passing the baton in terms of new generations of people interested in humanism, humanistic values in Europe. So when I was first asked to do this talk, I really jumped at the opportunity. Why? Very simply, because last year I was in this room, I think it was this room, and not entirely sure, are we, Peter? And Peter was moderating, and there was a group of students doing a discussion about the use of artificial intelligence in their different universities, in their curriculums. And I was really blown away by how already reflexive the students from this configuration last year were about things that really occupy me in my day job quite a lot. And I got to say, I was really particularly impressed by some students from St. Joseph University in Lebanon. Are there any students from there? Here? Yes, well done. You're carrying that reputation. So I was really blown away by that. And that's a long-winded way of introducing the fact that I really want to do this talk, but I've got 2 problems. That was the good news. Yeah, I've got 2 problems, which is the bad news. The bad news is I don't do many talks anymore. So I'm not terribly well prepared for this, not as well prepared as Ioannis. So I'm going to try and piggyback on a lot of what he said, but taking a very political science view that really complements, I think, what Ioannis was saying in terms of the way in which human dignity is at the forefront of human rights legislation, that whole architecture set up after World War II. And I'm going to be talking specifically then about the way in which in political science, we can see that populist parties, they use politics to vehicle a certain type of hate. And they have certain hate figures as part of that Ioannis has alluded to already. So that's one thing. The other piece of bad news is that, as you may have discovered, I have a very British accent in English, yeah? So it might not be easy for everyone to follow. If that's difficult, please raise your hand because I understand it. When I occasionally talk in English in this university, I know it's difficult. I think there's one student at ESPOL who's here. Yes. If I intervene in English in ESPOL, typically it's not always so easy. Yeah. So bear with me. And if you have difficulty, let me know. And as I say, I wish I had more time to prepare this, but here goes. So in terms of why I think we need to look at the politics of hate when we're talking about populism, I just have to draw your attention to this graph, which represents a phenomenon, a concept in the political science literature of what is called affective polarization. So you've got polarization, political polarization, whereby you have political parties of the left and the right, typically in the European tradition, that's the big cleavage. You have polarization between people who want to do some wealth redistribution, maybe some social liberal policies, and you've got people on the right who want free markets and they want maybe cultural conservatism. That's political polarization, whereby you're opposed on the basis of some political ideology. Affective polarization is connected, but it's different. So affective polarization means you haven't just got a political divide between voters. You haven't just got a difference of opinion on political ideology. You actually have really strong in and out group feelings. That is, you really like the people on your side. You really, really don't like the people who have a different opinion from you. And you see that in the data. So this is American data that starts under the Carter administration, 1980, where you can see that the top line is about Republicans and also Democrats. It doesn't matter which one of the two main parties. Both lines represent both parties in that sense. So what you see is that people who, in a sense, are either Democrats or Republicans, they have pretty much from Carter all the way to Trump to Biden, the same kind of feelings to their own group, their in-group, the people who are like them, the people who think like them, the people, that is, who vote like them. Then you look at the feelings towards the rival party, where traditionally the gap would have been of the order around 20, 25 percentage points in terms of the difference of how strongly you feel connected or not. Then when you start thinking about the progression from Carter to Trump, you have a collapse in the feeling of trust, of empathy, of fellow feeling with someone from that opposite party. Again, it doesn't matter if it's Democrats versus Republicans or Republicans versus Democrats. And that's something that is really powerful in the data. That's something really powerful to explain based on what you see, what you hear in conversations in American politics, but not just, I would say, yeah? So that's something that I really want to unpack for everyone today on the basis then that it's a two-way street. And on the basis then that if we think about affective polarization, this idea of really strong feelings of in-group loyalty, trust, adherence, and very strong out-group animosity, we can say that we have parallels to very dark antecedents in European history, whereby totalitarian regimes, of course, were founded on precisely those feelings of we are a group that needs to think and act together, and we hate, we dislike very strongly, we are opposed, we are threatened by a number of enemies from out with, yeah? And I mean, an illustration of that, which is in fiction, of course, but it's really very powerful, certainly was powerful when I read this many years ago when I was in school. That's George Orwell's 1984. So what have we got here? We've got a scene from one of the film versions of 1984, where you have the 2 minutes hate. The 2 minute, you're nodding, so we know about 1984. Yeah, it's great. There's, Thérèse, you introduced me when it came to having studied a long, long time ago in Cambridge. Cambridge University Library is famous, amongst students at least when I was there as well. I don't often have flashbacks to the 1990s, but today's maybe a time for that. It was famous because it's a very cavernous building with very long corridors, very oppressive architecture from the 1930s. It was actually used as the film set for, if I'm not mistaken, a Hungarian film rendition of 1984, which I think might even be this one, yeah? In any case, the point is that what's the 2 minutes hate all about? The 2 minutes hate is the society, Big Brother, on Airstrip 1, getting everyone together to vent their feelings against this sort of fictional bogeyman figure, this character of hate, who's also an anti-Semitic figure, Emmanuel Goldstein, in order basically to channel this notion of in-group feeling and out-group hate. Yeah, it's a really powerful part of that book, in particular when Orwell explains through Winston Smith then that the really powerful thing is not, in a sense, being forced to do this, but finding out every day that you actually feel like you have no other choice because you're sort of enjoying it, because it taps into that really dark part of the human psyche, yeah? And so that's why I wanted to really target in this talk that piggybacks onto what Ioannis was saying, this notion that the politics of hate is something specific to populists. It's very dark, but it's not just dark, it's also very focused, it's very strategic. So I'm going to talk more about what I mean by sort of hate as a form of politics by virtue of looking at 3 different targets, which will be familiar to you on the basis perhaps of what you read about, what you know about, and also because it's been very nicely prompted by what Ioannis was saying. Yeah. So the idea then that populist hate, which I must add also can be from the left as well as the right. We see that very clearly in a country like France. You have a lot of figures then who would be trying to vehicle types of hate towards institutions coming from Rassemblement National, but also from La France Insoumise, yeah? So in that sense, there's something that straddles a political divide there. And I would argue that's because it's very strategic. It's very targeted. Who are the targets then? We've got minorities. Ioannis was already talking a bit about that in terms of asylum seekers. I'll talk more specifically about why that's the case in a moment. And you've also got then institutions. You've got institutions on the basis, as Ioannis nicely explained, that pluralism at its core is anti-pluralist. And what are institutions? They're countervailing powers. They are things that, in a sense, might block the so-called will of the people. Populists have a problem with that as well. And then a final thing, which I think is really important to focus on, both as a political scientist, but also as a citizen, because I worry about what this means in terms of who then would be crazy enough to go into politics, is the fact that we see all around us the way in which hate targets specific individuals, in particular politicians, but not just, yeah? If you're on the receiving end of hate from populists as a politician, or in other examples I'm going to give you as a non-politician, it's not nice. And that's deliberate. There's something specific. There's something that is targeted there, of course, yeah? So if I think about hate towards minorities in particular in the shape of asylum seekers, yeah? I mean, Ioannis, you went into this, but I think one of the things to really bear in mind here is that when you're thinking about populists in terms of their communication strategy, not just their strategy to say, we represent the people against the corrupt elite, the strategy, the rhetorical, the communication strategy that goes alongside that is to use extreme language, to go for exaggeration, to really push political rhetoric, the boundaries of political conversation well beyond what has already been seen before. I mean, it's not for nothing then that Trump, to use the American vernacular, dropped the F-bomb in front of the cameras not so long ago when he was talking about Iran and Iraq. That's deliberate. Iran and Israel, of course. That's deliberate. That's the idea of being excessive. That's the idea of really trying to use that exaggeration for effect. Great example, of course, was also on the campaign trail when he was on television campaigning against Joe Biden. What does he say about asylum seekers, people who've come notably from Haiti? They're eating cats, they're eating dogs in Missouri, yeah? To go that further step in terms of demonizing people. And what I want us to focus on there is the idea that once you take such an extreme stance rhetorically, that's what feeds into effective polarization to the degree that that creates an attachment from within his own followers, but also a strong, understandably strong sense of rejection, of disgust from the people who don't support that. That's why you get not just political polarization, but effective polarization on the basis that I can't trust, I can't talk to people who follow this kind of politician and his political ideology, yeah? That's really important. The other thing to bear in mind in terms of hate towards asylum seekers, especially in a European, but also in a transatlantic context to a degree, is that it's associated with this political rhetoric around what Renaud Camus in France is infamous for, which is the great replacement theory. Yeah? The idea that there's also not just a sort of inevitable conflict-based, environmental perhaps, based, human rights-based logic to seeking asylum in other countries, but it's actually a covert operation by certain elites to undermine the stability, the identity, the ethnicity of a number of European countries. Yeah, that's a really powerful message that comes from the far right that is also feeding into then that effective polarization. The other obvious target for hate as vehicled by populists, as I say, from the left, from the right, are these institutions. Ioannis, you were talking as well about them, certainly judges. We have a big campaign against judges in the context of the aftermath of the British Brexit referendum in 2016, where you're trying to put pressure on judges. You're trying to demonize them, as you said, Ioannis. You're trying to make them targets of political anger, of hate, on the basis of saying, who are you to judge? Well, they are judges, but who are you to judge? Who picked you? Who selected you? What legitimacy have you got compared to a political decision, notably that of the referendum? Yeah. So that's a really powerful message as well. Other powerful messages are you target institutions that maybe stand up to politicians. Not many years ago, again, to go back to a Hungarian example that wasn't mentioned previously, but one which is really powerful politically, I think, possibly because I know people who studied there, people who work there still, but Viktor Orban was able to expel the Central European University from Budapest, from Hungary, yeah, to get rid of an institution of higher education like us, to force it to relocate to become a privately associated, incorporated university in Austria, precisely because he just didn't like it standing up to his policies, didn't like students mobilizing on the streets, shutting things down as well. As a director of a school, I don't like things getting shut down either, yeah? But there are different ways of dealing with that, perhaps. And yet here we were in modern 21st century Europe, and you have that power, that populist power to target and to actually enact the removal of that Central European University. That's a really powerful symbol, a powerful idea as well. And then obviously to go back to Trump, transatlantic example, and there the target, when he's talking about CNN and fake news, who's the target? It's the idea of trust in the media. It's the idea of actually being able to believe what you hear on TV. The idea then of saying that they're talking rubbish, I can talk rubbish as well. None of this really matters. And therefore, you're either with me or against me on that, especially when it comes to topics such as asylum, immigration, etc. Yeah, those are powerful ways of vehicling hate towards specific targets with specific intentions. Yeah, to shut down opportunities and institutions for countervailing whatever is happening at the democratically elected level. Yeah, and that's a debate that is long-standing in democracy. You can read Tocqueville, The Tyranny of the Majority. It's all there. That if you don't have those countervailing powers, then you have this crude majoritarianism that you mentioned as well. Yeah, and of course that's why we have institutions to defend that kind of pluralism. And then lastly, but by no means least, I would argue then that we also need to think about the way in which one of the other strategies of populism is not just to demonize certain minorities, not just to target, to go after really hard certain institutions that might be a thorn in your side, but also to target specific individuals who sort of represent what you don't like. So who might those be? Well, we've got George Soros, Hungarian, Jewish origin, financier, who was leading, by virtue of his investment in the Open Society Foundation, a number of NGOs, think tanks in a number of Central and Eastern European countries, and in particular was helping to finance the origins of the Central European University. Yeah, so really the target of some really vicious campaigns in Hungary, associating him precisely with this idea that he finances asylum applications. He finances, in a sense, a network of people bringing in asylum seekers into Europe precisely because he wants a different population, a more docile, in a sense, population. That's the accusation. And that really works, yeah? That really works to the extent that it shuts down the Central European University. It forces Soros to really rethink some of his strategies. That's a powerful, powerful strategic goal there. Then you've got this lady in the middle who was the first Black British member of Parliament, whose name is Diane Abbott. She's still in the British Parliament today. She's very distinctive, both by being the first Black British member of Parliament, female as well, but also because, and this is closely connected, she is the figure of, and the target, that is, of an absolutely disproportionate amount of hate, online in particular. So there was a big study of the abuse directed towards members of parliament a few years ago. So this dates, I think this data is from 2010, 2016. And what do you see? You've got 650 MPs in the British House of Commons. She's one person. She, when you looked at the data from, in particular, Twitter and a number of other social media feeds at that time, she was the target of half of the offensive messages. One person who's Black, who's female, who's from the left, was the target of all of that campaign of hate, yeah? Again, not necessarily, unfortunately, a surprise, but at the same time, the reason was to try and obviously discredit and to silence, yeah? The idea is it's strategic. And the same thing applies to the third person on this list, who's Greta Thunberg, who, of course, is associated with Fridays for Future, environmental activism, now a bit more, I suppose, with Palestinian activism. But at the same time, it's a huge figure of hate, a huge figure or target of vicious online campaigns. And there, to sort of conclude on a somewhat pessimistic note, the idea behind what I was trying to say in terms of effective polarization and where we have, in a sense, got to is that a lot of this hate that is political, and it serves a political purpose, therefore, it's not random. It's not, in a sense, blind. It's actually a targeted attempt to try and discredit, to disrupt, and to silence, precisely because if you are populist, you really need to try and express that will of the people, and you don't really accept countervailing narratives, different standpoints, those things that institutions of pluralism have always been set up to try and provide. And on that basis, the sort of logical extension of the politics of hate today is to target not just institutions, not just vulnerable minorities, but actually specific people who sort of stand up for those people, people who actually play a role in that politics. Yeah, you might disagree with their politics, but the way in which it's done is particularly hateful, and it's done for a reason, for a strategy. And that's what I wanted to get across in this talk. Not to say necessarily that there are these deep parallels with previous historical periods in Europe, but certainly to say that the politics of hate should at least concern us, especially because we need politicians, whatever their actual opinions perhaps, to represent us and to not be subjected to this. And who wants to be a politician or someone who stands up to people in power if this is what you get subjected to? And I think from a humanist perspective, that's a really important message to try and take away. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay. So is it okay for you? We hear a lot of perturbating position about populism. One of my first question for the two speakers would be, even if we are in countries well known for development of human rights, even in a country, in our Latin countries, and particularly I will speak about France, there is an increasing way for populism in France. I am very old, but not so much. It was 20 years ago, for instance, it was impossible to envisage the populism in France, for instance, as it is now, in fact. So why do you think in our Western countries, populism is increasing, gaining ground in Europe, in fact, and particularly in Western Europe? Why? So if I ask why, is to be able to repair, how to resist to that, and what kind of humanisms we need to resist. Because there are some reasons, and I'm speaking about people who are very honest, I would say, and who are very interested by populist point of view. It exists, this kind of situation. They are very honest. So where is the problem?
I'll try and have a go at that. I also think it might be interesting to hear some perspectives, some people in the audience about that one as well, because that's really difficult to pin down to any single factor. If you look at some of these political cycles and the way in which elections, they come and go, and they create hope, and they also then create feelings of resentment, despair even. One of the things to bear in mind there is the way in which populists and therefore populism is very much connected to that sense of disappointment, that you vote for change and then the change doesn't come. That was Obama's slogan. People have voted for Mitterrand in the past for change. And in 1983, he had to change quite a bit. And therefore, if you have these cycles of optimism, hope, and yet policies, for a number of reasons, they could be to do with political economy, they could be in the field of immigration, to do with human rights legislation, they could be to do with changes in technology. All of these things, when you then have to deal with a lot of electoral disappointment, dissatisfied voters, then voters basically can do one of two things. They can switch off and then they no longer vote, and then you don't necessarily need to worry about them so much. Until maybe you do have to worry about them because someone like Trump comes along, and Trump, using populism, and this is also something that is found in the data elsewhere, not just in the US, someone like Trump with his rhetoric, with his behavior, with his willingness to say and do pretty much anything, is able to get people to vote who no longer used to vote, yeah, who have given up because of their electoral disappointment, yeah. So that's a very powerful tool that populists have to get dissatisfied voters to try and vote for a final version of change that may or may not work. And even if you don't think it's going to work, the message of a Trump is that it's disruptive. And by that point, if you're that disappointed, you might just like disruption rather than continuity and stability, despite the obvious costs that you can see there. But I'd be interested to know what other people think.
Yeah, I would add that generally you find at the origin of the phenomenon a sort of crisis, whatever is the crisis. You find economic crisis. I had this experience with Greece, for example. In Greece, there weren't any more extreme right or extreme left parties for years. And finally, the economic crisis arrived in 2008 for 4 or 5 years, and people were really poor. They lost everything for some of them. And you find this populist ground, which is ready. If you take Hungary, Poland, you have the refugee crisis. This is a real crisis, and terrorism also is at the origin. You have the war in Syria or other regions of the world with a huge wave of refugees and migrants arriving in Europe. This is a reality. And the problem is the crisis is not the number of people. The crisis that Europe didn't find the means in order to share this responsibility around all the states of Europe. If you take Argentina, economic crisis also at the origin of what happened. If you take the United States of Trump, I'm not sure that Trump would be elected if COVID was not there. Why people in the United States were so disappointed with the former administration? Because finally, for years, what makes America first, the financial power of America was not present, but it was not at the origin a problem of the president that was elected. It was a problem linked to a sanitary crisis this time. And generally, we find a direct or indirect link with an important crisis, and also the political crisis, the fact that we don't believe anymore and we are not confident to the former parties, naturally.
A second question? Yes.
Good evening. I just wanted to ask something. I thought that in America, by Joe Biden, it was not that bad from an economical point of view, because he did it quite well. And I thought it was Trump who tried to believe that there was really a sincere crisis. Instead, it was not that.
I agree with you. It was not as bad, but it could be much better.
Yeah, that's a really neat point, but it also goes back to this notion of effective polarization, because if you look at the data, if you were a Republican under Joe Biden, you would say the economy was terrible. If you were a Democrat, you would say the economy is absolutely brilliant. Yeah, Joe Biden's doing a great job. So therefore, once you start having that degree of, as I say, not just polarization about politics, but about who you trust, who's in your group, who's not in your group, you also start interpreting what's around you in that very biased way. And therefore, that is a really powerful cycle to try and trap to get out of. It's really not very easy. And another thing to bear in mind, this notion about disappointment and how Trump really reaches people that you can't otherwise reach, is that the polling specialists would say that Trump has a high ceiling. Well, no, he has a low ceiling, so therefore he can't get that many more votes above even close to 50%, but he has a very, very high floor. That is, there are some people who will, whatever he says, whatever he does, as he said once, shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, they will still vote for him. He's got a very, very high floor below which his support will never fall, basically, yeah? And that's effective polarization.
Thank you very much. I follow you 100%. When actually you're also, introducing, even if perhaps into the line, the question of, who remains out of globalization, right? The missed promise of globalization that would have been also to improving, living standards for many, accessibility, open borders, all the things we like as liberals, as Europeans, and who didn't touch this dream, the left out of all this question, find comfort in this that you rightly said. Are also legitimate answers. Legitimate answers are legitimate questions and not legitimate answer to those legitimate questions. But my question is slightly different, is actually about how polarization follow politics, or better, how communication follow politics and how communication generates polarization. I was quite impressed by some data that I heard recently in a conference in Bicocca about how the algorithm, for example, in TikTok apparently is the worst in this sense, generates movements on posts that have the angry face. This was something I didn't know at all. They receive 6 more times the pushing in order to have this kind of hate reaction. The politics of hate that Andrew was saying. And for me, it was really impressive, the numbers. And how all this at the end follows politics and generates politics. So my reaction is really about, again, I don't want to go into general social media stuff, but in reality, it seems to be an anthropological change in democracy, all that, in my eyes, and the ways in which we live the democratic competition and so on.
We totally agree with you, and this is another extremely important element. And if you put it aside also with the education elements, that we are not educated anymore in order to know how we can have nice, correct, fact findings, etc. It's awful what is happening. So there is no more communication. And this is something that Professor Pillay was saying. If we in the universities offer the capacity to pass from an information finally to what is education, not education, we're saying to pass from information to knowledge and from knowledge to wisdom. And we have to help people to pass from information to knowledge, the true knowledge, because actually simple information and disinformation is considered as knowledge. And this is a huge phenomenon, anthropological one. We don't know how to handle it yet.
What are, according to you, the weapons, the ways to fight against populism? You say the Ioannis, knowledge, education, and so on. But in France or the States or in Korea, you quoted these countries, you find the people from the left to the right, from clever people to simple people, and they are in acquaintance with the populism. How do you explain this?
That's another tough one, Therese, yeah. And I mean, I think there are different things that attract people as well to that. First of all, it might be that people are attracted perhaps to the idea of untrammeled power. So what maybe attracts people is the idea that we should have strong executives. Yeah, some of the people who are really very much attracted to Donald Trump, to Viktor Orban, to other people of that type, is this notion then that parliaments are talking shops, parliaments do a lot of talking, and that they have, in a sense, not proved themselves to be that useful as institutions for getting things done. So I think there's a notion that the promise of populism, especially in the context of disenchantment, is that strong executives get things done, and that therefore people from different social strata, people who might be very humble in origin, people who might be very successful, are attracted to this notion that you need to be more powerful, you need to do away with certain institutions to get things done, and therefore to have a positive impact. So I think that's a very powerful message that resonates with a number of people, to the degree that the data shows if you are of an authoritarian personality, you're going to be much more likely to vote for a populist party. Yeah. So on that basis, there's also this notion then, to go back to a bit of what Ioannis was saying, that there needs to be perhaps more understanding of why absolute power, unrestrained by constitutions, by institutions, just like in an abusive personal relationship or workplace relationship, you can't just have unlimited power. It creates, even with the best intentions, it creates situations then of pressure, of abuse, and therefore of cycles of violence as well. And therefore, that needs to be something that perhaps comes across more in political education at school, in the way in which the institutions are also presented, in terms of what is the notion, what is the philosophy behind that? Because we perhaps maybe have lost track of that to the degree we see them more as obstacles rather than as institutions that prevent or even facilitate something that is collectively for the greater good.
I don't know what to say, because I have also the Greek example in the mind. Sometimes I feel that the societies need a crash in order to wake up. If we take the Greek situation, for example, even though it was not like Orban's government, if we take Tsipras, but we can consider that Tsipras, so the extreme left wing, was a sort of populist party. And they arrived at a moment where there was not another hope, any other hope. And people needed to see that utopia is not realistic. So sometimes we need to try in order to see that this is not realistic. I'm not saying that this is the solution. No? Mm-hmm. What are the solutions from my side? Of course, the first solution is education. And when I'm saying education, it's not just children education. Everybody has to be, again, educated. For example, to social media. I need to be educated to it in order to understand what my kids are facing every day, for example. And we need every time to gain knowledge of what is happening, how we are using the technological means, every kind of means that populists are using. This is one of the main elements, probably. The second, for me, I come back to my conclusion. In our societies, we need judges, we need limits, we need the elements that will provide with checks and balances. We need balances. So if I take the Orban situation, if the European Union didn't exist, if the European Court of Human Rights didn't exist, probably actually Hungary wouldn't be even this kind of false democracy. It would be a new tyranny in the doors in Europe, in Eastern Europe. So I believe that checks and balances are a way also to struggle, even though it is not offering anymore the solutions that we would like to have to it. I don't know what to say.
I have also a question. I mean, two. Isn't also okay, sorry. Isn't also maybe the fact that I have read some articles that talks about the identity crisis, in which person needs to find an identity, and like they go to certain people like to affirm themselves, and so it can create that mass that like that people want to search an affirmation, want to search, will go to certain groups, not just because they agree with that, but maybe just to have someone that share the same vision. And also I have another question. Isn't also no, my question, it was about the elite. Most of the time we talk that there is presidents, politicians, and journalists that create populism, but isn't sometimes also created by the people? Like we always seen that it is a movement where we have a representative person that encourage and that shares some opinions to the people, but isn't sometimes also the people that like create this movement?
Of course, people create this movement, but they need every time a charismatic leader. So the problem is not the people, but the leader at the moment, because we don't have direct democracy. We're not living in ancient Greece and Athens. So generally, it passes through representative democracy, what is happening, and you need this leader to be here. That is why our discussions are upon that. The first question.
Yeah, on the first question, that's a really interesting point, which is that there are sociological studies about the kind of personalities who are attracted to authoritarianism, who are attracted to also whatever is being offered that promotes a certain in-group feeling and an out-group notion of animosity. And I think that's that's the time to perhaps link back to this notion of what do we see in our online, in our virtual existence, a lot of hate, a lot of algorithms that make a lot of money out of hate as well. And that therefore as well, you mustn't be surprised that someone like Donald Trump is also trying to avoid regulation in the US, in Canada, in Europe, that might try and restrain that precisely because his model, both business and political, in a sense the two are linked, depends on having people who consume and normalize a huge amount of hate. So I think there is something really quite specific to that nowadays.
And I don't really believe that the quest of identity is something new, to be honest. But and people believe that this is a new phenomenon. No, the being patriots in the United States or in Greece or in Italy, this is totally normal. So finding a group, being part of this group, it is not a new phenomenon. But actually, once again, by using this extreme language, by using this extreme discourse, etc., we create the idea that there is an existence of an either better group that we can find and be part of it. So, but for me, it's not a new phenomenon, the quest for identity. And globalization was concerned as a menace, but also as probably as something that could be at the origin of good things for many people. So I'm not sure that this is whatever the doctrine says.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to both lecturers for these very interesting presentations. I have a question concerning the roles and responsibilities of political parties, especially in the European context. And we were talking earlier about how to fight populism. Now, we may observe that some political parties may be tempted to appear or to position themselves as even more and more consensual, just to say we are the democratic parties, and again we are the ones to fight populism precisely. Now, do you think, and sometimes at the cost of maybe wiping out very legitimate differences, I mean, between social democrats, conservatives, liberals. Now, do you think this is the right response of traditional parties to populism? And if not, what do you think are the roles and responsibilities of political parties in that context? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very tough question. And I should straight away point out I don't have the answer to it. However, it certainly prompts me to think about the way in which we have also good data, good evidence to suggest then that when you have center-right parties that try and adopt a policy platform on migration that looks more like populist right-wing parties, they get eaten up. And then also where you have good data which suggests that when you have center-left parties that are doing a bit like Tony Blair, maybe even Jospin back in the day, they do a bit too much market liberalism, they get eaten up by more far-left parties as well. So in a sense, there is something that in the mainstream, in the middle ground, is problematic in terms of business as usual or trying to adapt without having a new core identity to actually be able to sell, probably because they've run out of hope to sell. That's the problem, yeah? And that creates a lot of disappointment. And you see that with the collapse of these mainstream parties in a number of different countries.
Okay, so thank you for everything. And I have a question, like you mentioned the far left, but the examples that we have seen were of the far right in Hungary, Italy, and Poland. So my question would be, how does the politics of hate, the otherizations, the hate towards minorities, institutions, how does this manifest from the populism that comes from the far left?
Yeah, that's a really astute point. And again, the examples I was giving are not, in a sense, coincidental, precisely because these are parties that have been able to get into power, yeah, in a way that clearly, with some minor exceptions, sorry about that, Greece, wouldn't be so obvious from the far left. But the idea there is that the targets are maybe different in terms of institutions, but you see that very clearly in terms of La France Insoumise in this country. The main target is Parliament, yeah? The main target is the idea then that Parliament is useless, that the existing parties are useless, that you have a sort of uni-party of the middle ground, and that the only thing preventing a far-right takeover would be Mélenchon himself, who's extremely authoritarian in terms of how he runs his own party, and in terms of his concept of what a sixth republic should look like, yeah? And of course, we also have, as Ioannis is pointing out, what you might find in a place like Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, yeah? I'm not expert enough to talk about that. However, the assumption would be you fight against institutions, against rival parties and parliaments and courts that could potentially be a barrier to your vision of how to do politics and what politics should be for.
Foreigner, again, if we take this example, but the foreigner is not anymore the migrant. The foreigner is the United States of America. It's the rich one. So you find the similar elements of the conception of the political discourse, but with a different enemy this time. On a encore 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I don't mean to be despairing, but to go back to the ancient Greeks and Plato, they thought authoritarianism was inevitable. Democracy inevitably will go towards some form of authoritarianism. I don't agree. I don't want to agree with that. But have you any thoughts on that? That the demos will always take over. That's inevitable according to the ancient Greeks. Yeah.
It's not because I'm Greek that I have the answer. I don't know if Thierry has the answer, who is much more a philosopher than us. But in order to answer to that, as I said, sometimes in order to understand what is happening, we need a clash. And I believe this is probably my Greek origins, that our societies are at this moment where we need a crash in order to understand again. After the Second World War, we had 70 years of sort of peace in Europe. Now, apparently, we forgot what happened. Once again, I don't say that we need a third world war, but you see that we are almost at the beginning of a third world war. Iran, Israel, the United States, what is happening in the Middle East. A lot of people believe that we are already within the third world war. So I believe that there is a cycle in life, and apparently we are living this bad cycle where we need once again to see that utopia is not a solution and realism is much more at the origin of solutions than utopia. This is a way also to answer to your question. I believe that even though these parties, actually the middle parties, the parties of the middle, are not using another rhetoric, we need them once again, because at the moment we will need again realism. Probably they won't win the next elections in France or in other countries, but once again, in 5, 10, 15 years, we will need realistic solutions. And they are offering realistic solutions, whatever they are, left or right.
I just want also to point out something which I think it's quite important for education. In populism reactions, I have seen many times that there is a kind of oversimplification in front of complex issues. And one of the most difficult parts of education is to be able to go on with complexity and check and balance, as you said, and complexity in a scientific sense. That means it's not complicated, but complexity that means interactions between a lot of different parameters, so that the truth is not so obvious to find immediately. And very often with populism, we get with binary reactions, binary solutions, one oppositions, polarization, and not to try to find a common good, I would say, between these two. And I think that is one of the most important things in education at university, and I hope it is the case for you, to be educated to drive in complex situations. What do you think about that?
I totally agree with what you just said, Thierry. We need education in order to understand complex situations and in order to find solutions to them. And probably education is one of the main elements of our solutions. I don't know if...
So a way to link that point by Thierry to the question just before, which is to say that if you go back to 1776, when the people who were thinking about the American Constitution got together, more like 1787, sorry, got the dates wrong, in Philadelphia, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about how you prevent democracy from degenerating into some kind of populist authoritarianism or a very much strongman dictatorship by some powerful elite figure. And there the idea is they understand that complexity needs to be an institutional design that is at the heart of politics. So they come up with this compound republic, that's Madison, that's the Federalist Papers, and they try and bring together different checks and balances to try and do that on the basis of having thought a lot about the different examples that they had to available at the time. Now we have a lot more examples available, I think, and therefore that's why we need to think about very much strengthening certain institutions. It could be the media, if we think about how social media is eating traditional media, not necessarily in terms of where we get content from. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I just have a problem in terms of the quality of the content and what is actually allowed or not, what is regulated or not. Because you can maybe regulate a lot of political content on television, but you don't do that on social media. That makes a mockery of the regulation for political speech, for political advertising, therefore. And so you need to, in a sense, be aware of the way in which things have developed, and we need to, in a sense, rethink maybe some of our institutions.
So one last question, and this question is for Thérèse for her last day of working.
I was impressed by the use of the word hate. Hate is very hard. Some words about this. And secondly, and I hope not to be shocking, don't you think that in our organizations, establishments, and so on, more exemplarity, less corruption, less weaknesses could be a way to fight against some difficult things as hate, which is really a hard word?
Yeah, it is very hard. And I think, though, it has to be recognized as such precisely because, and this is why it was so nice to follow on from Ioannis's talk, because if you think about human rights law, it's about human dignity. Hate is an attack on human dignity, yeah? And therefore, it's very powerful, it's very hurtful, and it also provokes, on the part of the victims, a very difficult emotional response, so that it's also a common phenomenon to think that victims can become perpetrators of hate in turn, because that's what happens when you're subjected to hate. We see that. That's why I think also what you're saying about exemplarity, about turning the other cheek as well, in a sense, is about moderating the response to hate so that that doesn't become a cycle of the kind of polarization that the data suggests we have unfortunately been trapped in.
And of course, the last part of your reaction or remark, I would say more than question, refers to justice for me. And as we said, for me at least, the rule of law is one of the elements in order to fight against that. We need justice and we need independent judges, national or international, European or international. We don't care, but we need people that try to make effective the laws we adopted and the main values on which are constructed our societies. Voilà. Thank you very much to all.